So now we've learned how speciation happens, the variation that goes into play, the reproductive isolation that needs to happen, and while you could make hybrids, the hybrids are the exceptions and not the rule. Now, it's really important to understand why we know this. What evidence do scientists have that speciation happens? Because while I can tell you this story about here's how it happens, and maybe that story makes sense, it's also really important that we have evidence to back that up. Now, as I mentioned before, the human lifespan is so short in comparison to the life that exists on Earth. And evolution and speciation happen over long periods of time. And so scientists have to rely on different forms of evidence because we can't just be like, let me write to my notebook. I see that happening today, and here's what's happening tomorrow. It's a long scale process. So let's talk about the different pieces of evidence we have that speciation is actually occurring. So the first one I'm going to start with is looking at homologous structures. Now I'm going to pause you right there. We've talked about analogous structures before. Remember, analogous structures was the consequence of natural selection. If you have multiple organisms living in the same environment, the environment is going to have similar pressures on that organism. For example, organisms that live in the ocean, their limbs are this kind of fin shape, whether you're a shark or a fish or a whale, very distantly related organisms, but they kind of look similar because of that shared habitat. So now let's refocus on what's on here, the homologous structures. So homologous structures are essentially, it's the same body part, but it's found in unrelated species. So for example, here we have 4 arms. We have a human, so our arm, we use it to pick up things. You have a cat, they use it for walking. You have a whale, that's their limb. And for a bat, that makes up their wing. So 4 very different functions. But let's look internally. So on humans, here's our humerus, so the bone that runs in our, in this part of the arm, is the humerus. You've got the radius and your ulna. You've got the carpals and metacarpals. And you've got phalanges. And there's a lot more things in there. And it's okay, you don't need to write those. But let's take a look at a cat or a dog. They also have a humerus. They've got a radius and ulna. They've got carpals and they've got phalanges. Okay, well, let's look at the whale. They've got a humerus, a radius and ulna, carpals, and phalanges. And bats, also a humerus, a radius and ulna, carpals, and phalanges. So all these very different organisms, we've got mammals, although these are all mammals, all very different mammals, we have the same basic body plan, despite the fact that the function of that body part is so different. A wing is incredibly different than an organism that's walking, which is incredibly different from an organism that's swimming. How can this information support a common ancestor? Well, think about it. We know that natural selection is kind of making organisms more adapted to their environment. So if we had a common ancestor, that would explain the bone structure, right? If one organism has a humerus, a radius, an ulna, the carpals, the metacarpals, the phalanges, you got one organism that has all those things. And then speciation is occurring. So some organisms more closely tied to water, some more closely tied to land. Now they still have that same structure, right? They still have those same bones, but natural selection is acting on them differently. Organisms that are more in the water, okay, they're going to start, the organisms that have smaller humeruses are able to swim faster, so they reproduce. For bats, those that have longer phalanges have a larger wingspan, meaning they fly more and catch more food, so they survive. It makes a whole lot more sense to say, yeah, there was one organism that had that bony structure, and all of these are just variations of that. If common ancestry and speciation didn't happen, if whales came out of nowhere, if cats came out of nowhere, how do we explain that we're using the same exact skeletal plan? It is a lot more, like statistically speaking, it is a lot more crazier that this was 4 independent acts of evolution. That 4 independent organisms came up with this body plan independently. And this is just for simple examples. You can think of most mammals have the same exact body plan. It makes more sense, and statistically speaking, it uses less steps to say there was one organism that then diverged. So it's really a statistics problem. Statistically, homologous structures are more likely to happen than random independent evolution of the same exact body plan. Related to homologous structures is this idea of vestigial structures. These are structures and behaviors that seem to have, as far as we know, no apparent function in these organisms. So I'm going to use whales as an example. What's being highlighted in this whale here is the hip bone. A hip bone, thinking about humans, the hip bone is what our legs attach to. Well, if you look at a whale, whales do not have those hind legs, but they still have that hip bone. And so the hip bone in whales is an example of vestigial structure. They have this structure, and as far as we can tell, there is no apparent function. Now, I said before, this is related to homologous structures. Let's talk about why. So the reason it's related is thinking about why they have hip bones. If we were to argue, whales, bam, independently became whales, then why in the world do they have hip bones, right? This is not helping them in any way. Natural selection would never favor, you know what? Whales should have hip bones. They're not going to use those hip bones. Not going to help those whales. Not going to hurt those whales. They're just going to have this really random structure in them. That's not how that works. It's much easier to explain the presence of those hip bones by saying, well, whales may have had a common ancestor. Maybe a common ancestor with humans, and that common ancestor had hip bones because they had rear legs. And then through natural selection, those hind legs got more and more diminutive in whales, and that's all that's left behind is the hip bone, which isn't hurting it. It's also not helping it, so it's just kind of remained there. So it's an artifact of ancestors before you. Now, the whale hip bones is kind of a famous example. But wings of ostriches and other birds, such as emus and cassowaries, that these organisms have wings. They don't fly with them, though. And this is an example of vestigial structure. The ancestral bird had these wings, and through natural selection, ostriches got selected for their nice long legs instead of their wings. In humans, we have tons of different vestigial structures, one of which being goosebumps. So goosebumps make your hair rise. That serves a couple of different functions. So in other mammals, especially if you guys have a cat or dog, you may have seen this. When cats and dogs are scared or aggressive or agitated, their hair stands up. It makes them look larger. It makes them look more imposing. In other species, in other mammals, I should say, when we see them have goosebumps, it creates this larger area of fur. And it actually helps insulate them more, which is why it happens when you're cold. If you're cold, if you can poof up your hair, there's more insulating power in that. But, I don't know how hairy you are. I would hate to speak for you. But this is something we can't control. Us as humans, I can't be like, I want some goosebumps right now. Like we can't do that, right? But it happens. It's a behavior that you and I cannot control. It's a behavior that we no longer use. Like, we do not have nearly enough hair to be imposing on someone else. We don't have nearly enough hair to actually make us warmer. So why in the world does our body do this? It would be really freaking random if our body's like, you know what? This is how we're evolving this week. We're making goosebumps in the human race. No, it makes a lot more sense that, okay, we had a common ancestor to other mammals that did have these goosebumps that do serve a purpose. It's just in humans, they no longer serve a purpose. So again, similar to homologous structures in the sense that the reason we have them is other related organisms also have them. It's a very similar structure. It's just, at least with vestigial structures, that structure doesn't have a function necessarily in all the organisms that it's found in. Another piece of evidence of common ancestry or the fact that speciation occurs, so speciation kind of forming from other species, is looking at embryos. Now, this particular diagram is looking at the embryos of just vertebrate species, so things that have a backbone. So going from fish, salamanders, turtles, chickens, pigs, cows, rabbits, man. So very, very different organisms, especially thinking about man being a mammal and fish. But look at this first row. This first row is the embryo of all those 8 different species, the very initial embryo, I should say. This would be, well, it depends on the organism, but this could be a couple days to a couple of weeks after inception. And look how similar we are. Honestly, I think this piece of evidence is the strongest just because you just see it. This fish embryo and this human embryo, we look so similar. How in the hell can we look so similar to fish if we have no relationship with fish whatsoever? It's because we do. We do have a relationship with fish. Is that we have a common ancestor, all of these backbone organisms, us, birds, bats, turtles, reptiles, we all share a common ancestor, a common backbone ancestor. And this is what that embryo probably looked like as well. And it worked, right? I mean, throughout development, you do see, okay, now we're starting to get some differentiation between the different species. But how in the world do we all look so similar in the beginning if we're not somehow related to one another, so to speak? It makes more sense that this initial shape was successful. Natural selection didn't need to change that shape at all because it worked. It changed it a little bit later on in development, but the early stages still work. So just thinking about very similar embryos, it's statistically speaking, it is a lot harder to explain, hey, here's 8 different species that all have this more or less the same exact embryology the first couple of weeks of life. It's statistically harder to prove that. It's a lot easier to say, oh, well, there was one species that then diverged. So that form occurred once. Or you could be, oh, well, that form evolved 8 times. Statistically, that is difficult, and this is only a subset of the vertebrate organisms. So we're going to go ahead and pause real quick. There's a video coming up. You're going to start watching like the first 30 seconds, and you're going to be like, what are we watching? You can honestly skip the first 30 seconds. I don't exactly know where they're going with it. Anyway, this has a lot of CGI looking at the development of different organisms. There's nothing new or new in this video, but I think it has some really cool imagery, and it's showing you the development of a lot of different species and really showing you the similarities that exist between very different species. So go ahead and pause this video, click the link of the video coming up, and then come back here. So pretty wild, right? How elephants and chickens and humans, like so very different organisms, are so common those very first stages of life. And the only thing that can really explain that is that if we all had the same blueprint, and that same blueprint would be a common ancestor. We can't have independently all come up with the same idea. All right, another piece of evidence. We have 2 more pieces of evidence left. The first one being molecular biology. And so what I mean by that is let's go into our molecules. And by molecules, we'll look at things like DNA and closely related proteins. So as a very quick recap, remember that DNA is essentially the instructions on how to build proteins. So they kind of go hand in hand with one another. Now this particular chart, this is not something you need to record, but I want to kind of explain how we use molecular biology. So this chart is looking at cytochrome C. Cytochrome C is a protein. It's a protein that's used to wrap DNA actually. But because it's a protein, that means it was coded by DNA. Now, proteins in all organisms, bacteria, plants, protists, animals, fungi, all of them, all proteins are made out of building blocks called amino acids. Now, organisms that are closely related to each other, I mean, they have these proteins, they all have cytochrome C, they all need to wrap their DNA. But to create cytochrome C, they might use different amino acids. What's kind of cool is you can actually tell how related something is with one another based on how similar their proteins are. So for example, the second column says number of amino acid differences from humans. So let's say we've got the human template. How similar is our cytochrome C protein to chimpanzees? Well, it's pretty freaking similar. There's actually no differences. Our cytochrome C is exactly the same as chimpanzees. We're about 1 amino acid difference from the rhesus monkey. Okay, so we have this protein, but it's a little different. Essentially, that probably means there was more time in evolution between us. Rabbit, it's 9. Cow, it's 10. Bullfrog, so we're an amphibian now, 20. Fruit flies, we are no longer backbone organisms, 24. Wheat germ, so this is a wheat germ looking at plants, and then yeast looking at fungi. So you can see that the more removed or the more different organisms are, their proteins are a lot different. Their DNA is a lot different. But the closer relationships they have, that means they're more related to one another. And we can visually see this. We can visually see, there are similar characteristics with chimpanzees and humans than there is with humans and yeast. The other, I think, kind of really strong argument that I have for molecular biology is DNA. You guys have learned in different biology courses that DNA is made up of 4 base pairs, the G, T, A, and C. We're not going to talk about what they are. It doesn't really matter. But I think what's really strong evidence to even argue that there was only one life form that started the rest of life on Earth is the fact that we all have the same DNA. Now, not exactly the same. The orders is different. But my DNA has G, T's, and A's and C's. My dog's DNA has G, T's, A's, and C's. The birds, the fungi, the plants, the bacteria, the archaea, the protists, every living thing on Earth has a double helix DNA. It has instructions to create proteins. It has these same 4 base pairs. They are lined up as chromosomes. How in the world, if you can, there's, I think there's an estimated this number is going to be so wrong, like 1.7 billion species on Earth have been named. Every single one of those species uses DNA to make proteins. Every single one of those species has G, T's, A's, and C's. How in the world could they have each independently come up with the molecule DNA? We're going to kind of expand this. You know, we're searching for life in other galaxies and in other worlds. And in that search, you know, we're not expecting to find like, all these independent organisms making all their independent compounds. It's hard to find life. Life is really freaking unique. And so for you to say, well, every single life form independently evolved to be who they are today is impossible. We can't even find one life form on like any other planets. And you're going to tell me that billions of organisms just came out of just evolved on their own? No. It makes a lot more sense to say, well, there was one organism or one group of organisms that had this DNA, and then as they evolved, they're passing on that trait to the next generation, because it works. And if it works, it's going to maintain itself. So, sorry, honestly, this is probably one of the most interesting things I find about life, is just the fact that DNA, it connects all of us together. So I think it's really cool. Okay, last piece of evidence I have for you is probably one of our stronger pieces of evidence, but it's one of our rarer pieces of evidence, and it's looking at fossils. Now, fossils can tell us about organisms that no longer exist, and it can show us like, hey, like, we can't find fossils of birds, whatever. So fossils at least are showing us evidence that like, hey, Tyrannosaurus rexes used to exist and they don't exist now. So obviously species are changing over time. But the kind of fossils that I want to focus on are fossils called transition fossils. So again, the fossils we'll focus on as our evidence is transition fossils. And transition fossils are organisms that are kind of showing us the in-between, the creation, so to speak, of new groups of organisms. So I've got the fossils here of 2 of them. Let me write out the names very poorly for you. This first one on the left is called Tiktaalik. And Tiktaalik is our transition fossils between the sea and land. And we'll talk more about that transition when we talk about it in our later units. So Tiktaalik was an organism that had very similar characteristics to those of reptiles that we found in the water, but started to have characteristics of land organisms. There was evidence of primitive lungs in the Tiktaalik. There was evidence based on where we hypothesized musculature was that they were able to move their limbs on land. And this transition kind of showed us like, hey, organisms did exist around this time period where they were in the ocean, and then we find land animals, and then right in the middle, we're finding these organisms that have characteristics of both. And it kind of showed us that, wow, there is something happening here, that this is how we went from this species to this species. We literally are seeing the intermediate. This second fossil over here, this is Archaeopteryx. Archaeopteryx. You can totally Google that to make sure I spelled that right, because that looks not right. So Archaeopteryx is essentially our first bird fossil, but it's not a bird. It's still very much reptilian. It has a tail like a reptile. Some of the jaw structure is very similar to a reptile. The way the bone structure in general is still very reptile-esque, but 1, it has feathers, but 2, it has feathers that are forming in kind of this wing shape. And so Archaeopteryx, again, is appearing in the fossil record. Like we see birds and we see reptiles, and it's like, oh, well, how did we get from reptiles to birds? And then bam, we see Archaeopteryx, and it's found in the rocks that are in between birds in the fossil record and reptiles in the fossil record, and we are seeing that in-between organism. So transition fossils are amazing pieces of evidence that speciation happens. The unfortunate thing is they're rare, right? We don't see, not everything fossilizes, and just because it fossilizes doesn't mean we found it. So it's a rare piece of evidence, but a very strong piece of evidence if we have it. So that's where we're going to end. So we actually have tons of different pieces that evidence, we have tons of different evidence of speciation. 1, we can literally see it with transition fossils, but it's also a lot easier to explain the similarities between species with this idea of speciation versus this idea of every single organism evolved or came to be independently. That is a whole lot harder to explain statistically than saying, oh, there's one organism, and from there, all these other organisms share those traits. It's a lot more simplistic, and scientists in general kind of stick by this idea is that the simplest explanation is most likely the correct explanation. And we use that for a lot of different things in science. And for the times that we can prove it, that's usually pretty true. And it's a lot easier for us because we don't have to worry about these super complicated explanations. Like, simplest one, probably the right one. So there you go. Lots of evidence that speciation has happened, is currently happening, and will continue to happen.